How would you define an activist?
How would I define an activist? That's a really great question. The reason why I think it's a great question is because it keeps coming up.
Thinking about like people's limitation of activism to like setting things on fire versus like feeding your neighbor when they're sick or whatever. So the prompt that I think both in the room and to the audience is, what's the smallest act of contributing to your community that is impactful?
Okay. All right. Hi, my name is Mahingan and I'm 13 years old. Alright, so a couple months ago, like I think around when the first kind of unmarked graves were being found, my teacher put a question about the Johnny McDonald statue. I don't remember what the question was, but I wrote a little essay about it. I felt like it needed to go. I didn't really know much about him, but I knew that he was a bad man, and
The expectation of like that all you guys are gonna do is give. Like people who are in service to the community are like just constantly here to give. And then we'll rehabilitate our audience to making an offering. Yes, that's meaningful. Activist. There, it's not dirty anymore. Everybody's an activist.
I like that.
Activism can look very different depending on who we are, what kind of privileges we have, where we are arranged in society.
Sometimes it can get toxic. I stretch myself too thin, and I sometimes do too much, and I get tired and stressed, but
An activist serves the collective good in their unique way. Sometimes it might look like a racialized person choosing rest, briefly turning away from their suffering so that they might be nourished by pleasure.
at the end of the day, I'm happy with the work that I'm doing, and I can sleep when it gets a little bit better, maybe.
Like I just felt like I needed to be doing something. I needed to. I don't know. I wondered what my role in the situation in my city, what I was supposed to be doing as an artist.
With the recovery of our children, and working with some of the folks in the city that reached out to be like, we need to do something. I was like, I can do things. And I think that's part of even how I deal myself with trauma. I do things, and I am a nurturer. So I was like, how do we create space for our community and help them heal through this?
It can take the form of, protests in the streets, of press conferences with local community organizations that are trying to draw attention to an issue. Some people take to social media or support in the background, where they're not in a position to risk the same kinds of things.
I think there's space also for all these kinds of activism to happen. I don't think it has to be about one kind of gold standard of activism. I think that's also kind of toxic in a way, right? There has to be space for people to participate. And I think there needs to be some healing. The amount of work, the shouldered activism, advocacy, community work, volunteering, alleyway cleanups, whatever you want to call them, right, that the citizens of this city have taken on for decades is extraordinary. We're known as a city of volunteers for a reason, and that volunteer burden takes a toll over time. So I think we have to have those with the resources step up, let people have a bit of a psychic break, do some realigning, and then reevaluate our priorities. That's the only way we're going to do this is together and by kind of coming to the table in that kind of spirit.
Go on a walk with someone and let them talk. Take deep interest. Go fishing into their embodied ocean. Your question is the fishing line. Your listening the spinning reel. Their honest and brave truth, the fish. This is how we take care. We ask, we listen, we eat.
When we do one twist. One twist would be chicken, and then no twist at all is veggie or vegan. Yeah, so yeah.
Genius.
Yeah. Which also comes from our mom.
Thinking about the envelope of being queer downtown and where you can go to be safe, to be in community with one another. It matters and it means something. And so I think it's hard sometimes to make the point, to convince an amalgamated city, look, like this is a real issue. We need safe community spaces for queer, trans, two-spirit folks, for BIPOC to be in community with one another.
You're bound to one another in the work, in the struggle. I think this is what solidarity could look like if we're not thinking about how we're members of some collective that has an official designation, but rather, how do we connect with each other in trustful, respectful ways that acknowledge that we all have different positions in this struggle, but we care about each other in a way that's supportive for also political ends and aims. I think that is something that keeps a lot of people going.
So I didn't know this, but recently Hamilton got named the hate crime capital, I believe, of Ontario or Canada. It might be Canada, and if it's Canada, that's pretty bad. It is bad in both scenarios.
I tell the story of my first experience of getting followed around in a Shoppers Drug Mart, and not really understanding what was going on when nobody else was being followed. I didn't tell anybody about that incident for some time until I heard somebody else tell a similar story. And then there's this kind of collective critical consciousness where people understand their social conditions by sharing stories and experiences with others.
We are the ones who look like the soil in your planters and the gingerbread men you make on Christmas. The ones who are the coffee beans, your complex order from Starbucks we have been brewed to a fine dust. I am someone who has given quicksand skin an excuse for your harsh gaze to sink in slow. I carry my mother's sweet chocolate words and my father's soot-soaked hours of labor. I am the brick for your chimneys and the lumber sacrificed for the fire, the spices you came to my people for, blended together in mortar and pestle concocted this melanin that you wish you could taste. I am the one you raised the gun at, the one that you said looked like a threat. This skin was the stage where your appreciation became fear, and from this I learned, no matter how nurturing the tree, people may still bring axes to your trunk. Is that better?
Like, what are the moments of hope that you've identified in the last couple of years? Where do those come from?
When I came to Hamilton, I got connected to a group that was advocating for a kind of program, an initiative, a service that thought about the impacts to individuals who have experienced hate or racism and what we do for them to convey some validation, to offer some support and some follow-up. And that work went into a pitch that got shut down a number of times over several years.
I think we realize what we're asking is difficult because we are asking to take the city to take a leadership role, both symbolically and with money. And yet asking the city not to have it as a city-driven process because we want it as a community-driven process. And we realize that that is a difficult ask, but I think it's the only way that this will succeed in the way that it should succeed.
I think your assessment was correct. It's a difficult task. Thank you.
But eventually, we came back with this idea of a partnership. The Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion, McMaster University, and the City of Hamilton agreed to pilot this idea that we had for the Hamilton Anti-Racism Resource Center, whereby we're thinking about what's happening across sectors in healthcare and education, such that our advocacy work is attached to our stories, and they're not just taken from us for somebody else's political aim.
It's in the spirit of centering the leadership of racialized residents. It's in the spirit of deepening our entire city's understanding of how racism is experienced across this city, and most importantly, with the goal of supporting the residents who experience that racism on a daily basis, that we must get Hark Up.
And they still do a lot of work with the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion, who has been a real leader.
It's time for you to stop feeling guilty. The opportunities that you've acquired are based on exploitation, and now you have to step up.
They've been a kind of mentor or a house for emerging organizations and advocacy organizations. The Hamilton Encampment Support Network, the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, who's now a registered not-for-profit on its own. And those groups have demonstrated a capacity to kind of work together across social issues in ways that are always thinking about who we've left out.
We are being threatened with police. We are being threatened with police for asking a simple yes, no answer question. This is a democratic process. We are allowed to protest. We are allowed, I don't know why you're shaking your head, Councillor M. Wilson. We're allowed to be in here to make our voices heard. It wasn't for civil unrest that gave you the right as a woman to sit at that table.
Order, please. Call security and have the alley cleared. This committee stands in recess. I ask the councillors to leave the room now, please. Sincerely.
I would say we have a set of systems that have fostered a climate of bad listening. And what we see is people being labeled as, problems, as troublemakers, as people who are not following the rules or breaking the laws when they're just trying to raise a concern that has been addressed. Yeah. And we've seen that in situations where activists have been attacked by Hamilton police, arrested for offering aid to others in the community, and it shuts down the ways that we can have conversations and move things forward.
And it's probably a good thing because HCCI, while they do get some funding, I believe, from the city, has become a big critic of the city. And I want to make sure that if we're going to fund you, you're not going to go down that same road. The mayor finally had to write an op-ed or an opinion piece in the Hamilton Spectator about the HCCI and their incorrect criticism.
So I am sensitive to, in giving money, the quid pro quo is not that you cannot be critical. That is part of a civil society.
Activist has become a bad word. It seems to be this really ambiguous, strange term. For me, it's always just been used in a way to describe people who are actively part of their communities. I think it should be that way and treated neutrally that way. So everyone feels they can be part of those spaces. Because the minute you start to stigmatize these kinds of words and stigmatize this language, it keeps people out, and it means that they don't want to participate in that anymore, right? So it shrinks activist circles and makes it harder for people to organize safely.
And so a change that I'd like to see in Hamilton is a real visceral feeling of understanding between communities, because the division that I had mentioned earlier is something that I clearly see in Hamilton. I see segregated groups of people, but to be able to pull people from all over Hamilton to have little seeds in the community of, hey, now you know, right? Now you know that what you thought might not be accurate. Take it back to your community.
I think one of the biggest things is the lack of acknowledgement for Indigenous people's relationship to land and place. The lack of education around treaties and treaty responsibilities, and the fact that this country would not exist without treaties, and that every single person that lives on these lands have a responsibility to understand what those are. And addressing Indigenous concerns, priorities, a lot of that stems back to treaties and understanding them and our roles and responsibilities within those treaties.
So they were thinking about issues of land occupation and indigenous rights, and how we think about, are you in a place that you don't belong in, and should you be removed or criminalized for experiencing the circumstances of our broader lack.
I would, drive along King Street and I would see folks out there. I'd, walk around Jackson Square and I would see folks that I perceived, anyways, to be unhoused. And I just thought, there are so many people here. What am I supposed to be doing? I can't solve this with money. I don't have the money to be able to find housing for everybody. But what can I do as an artist to make a difference? And so a couple of us got together. Some people made sandwiches. I had a wagon, and anybody showed up, and we would set out on a loop of downtown Hamilton. And that was my first action to figure out, okay, what is my role here? What do I need? Because I knew I needed to learn first before I could just go out and start doing whatever I thought I needed to be doing. I needed to hear what the community needed, not what I thought they needed. And they would just, because somebody was there to listen, and the stories that would pour out of people as you're standing there were amazing. I just thought, you haven't had anybody to talk to maybe all week, Keeping Six is an organization that supports and defends the rights of folks who use substances, and it works with, it's a grassroots, peer-led organization that works with folks where they're at. And so what we discovered the relationship could be, because I don't have the lived experience, but but what the relationship I could have with Keeping Six was my ability to kind of organize an art and writing drop-in for them. At one of the resting and hygiene centers, St. Pat's was the first one, and then at the New Vision, and then at the Wesley. To work alongside folks like that makes it more apparent to me that we have so much commonality with folks. We might have different lived experiences, but the art and writing is what ties people together. And the powers that be need to recognize that when you lift up people, you lift us all up, that we're not, separate from each other. And that, that's the part.
Folks need to see who's missing from the table. How do we get those folks to the table? And once they're there, how do we make sure that they're safe when they're there? We need to co-create, and we need to abolish some things and redesign them together.
We can't reach everybody, but we can reach key people who could then reach other people. And so giving them something that's worth talking about, giving them something that they can bring home is what I'd like to feel in Hamilton.